But moving on, for the toolkit there, as you can see, the address un-innovation.tools/register. Please do engage with that. For many of you, you have seen this in the past. The UN Innovation Toolkit was specifically developed by the UN for the UN. It came about following a call from the Secretary General for innovation to become part of the new normal within the system. And it was developed by the CEB in close collaboration with UNIN and with the agencies outlined here, agencies and entities outlined here, developed so that we could have UN-based case studies within the toolkit, so that we are able to better make connections and better contextualize from a UN perspective. It features an online diagnostic tool, which I really would encourage you to undertake, even if it is just the first engagement with the toolkit, because what that does is allows you to identify a baseline. It gives you data that you are able to action interventions upon, and then you're able to come back. It records your initial baseline data. You're able to come back with your team or your unit and redo the diagnostic and see, you can track how the intervention has assisted you in your readiness to innovate, which is the focus of that diagnostic. You will recall, for those of you who have joined us, that we have so far covered 2 of the modules in the program. You will understand that the toolkit separates the modules out into, separates innovation out into these modules, 5 of them: strategy, partnerships, architecture, culture, and evaluation, as introduced by Johanna, and forming the acronym SPACE. So far in this series, we have covered strategy, where we looked at the Innovation Planner tool. We have covered partnerships, that was just last week, where we looked at defining a value proposition. And those recordings of those webinars are available on the UNIN website. So thank you again to Johanna and UNIN for putting those up and hosting those. Today, we are going to be having a look at the architecture modules. Now, when we talk about architecture, we need to understand that we can't treat innovation as a series of consecutive projects. Oftentimes that's how it begins, projects that are put together by particularly motivated teams or teams that are finding they are having to innovate. However, when we talk about architecture, we're talking about how we can encourage our teams, our units, and our organizations to incorporate innovation as part of what we do, as our general process. We need to understand that this capacity for innovation does take time, and we understand that even in times of crisis that we're going through at the moment, there is bureaucracy that needs to be dealt with. There is new ways of learning, new ways of thinking that have to be developed so that we can work to build capacity for innovation. So it is something that needs to be taken with a fairly long-term view if we're talking about designing architecture and incorporating architecture for innovation. We need to work on identifying how we can make innovation a repeatable process, something that is incorporated at the start of our project design processes, at the start of our communication, at the start of our planning. And then also we need to work out how we can incorporate life cycle approaches to innovation. And there are tools around that also within the toolkit. So I would encourage you to engage with that, with the toolkit again. When we look at architecture, there are 4 specific tools that are available online within the toolkit. There is the Scan the Horizon tool, the User-Centered Design tool, the From Pilot to Scale tool, and the Operating Model tool. So all of these, again, working on how you can start to have conversations, perhaps based on the information that you have received through the diagnostic, as to how can we work to build innovation as part of how we do things, as one of the starting points for discussion when we talk about how to deal with our mandate, how to deal with the issues, how to deal with the expectations that we have. Today, we are going to be focusing on the User-Centered Design tool, and I believe, Johanna, you have another poll for us at this time.
Yeah, indeed, putting it up just now, and we were wondering in this poll how many of you have used the tool already. I'm going to leave it open for a couple of seconds because I think it's popping up on your screens as we're speaking. 30 votes and counting. Okay. Oh, it's good that we kept it up so long, Baron, because we've just had our first person who said that, yes, they have worked on it. So capping it here, and hopefully you can see the results on your screen now. So most colleagues saying they're not familiar with it. So you have a good audience for the introduction.
Certainly.
Around 20% have looked at it, and 2 people have worked with it already. So thanks to those of you, and we might be wanting to hear your experiences later on.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Johanna. That's interesting. Okay, so we are going to be looking at the user-centered design tool. And when we start looking at the user-centered design tool, we need to ask ourselves, well, what does it actually mean? So it allows us to learn about the specific needs and characteristics of your innovation end users. And I really do want to highlight this point. The tools are designed specifically around innovation. There are a huge amount of tools online. There's a huge amount of literature and information online around user-centered design. However, the toolkit, and one of the beauties of the toolkit is that it brings the discussion within this tool down to the scope of innovation. How are you envisaging your innovation end users for any innovation-focused project that you are looking to implement, looking to develop? And of course, the processes could be used for identifying and engaging with end users in other processes as well. But the beauty of the toolkit, once again, is that it brings it down to the level of innovation. And it allows you to develop innovative solutions that reflect the needs and desires of your end users. And of course, this is super important when we talk about engaging in times of lower resources. We don't want to be wasting resources on solutions that are out of scope, solutions that do not directly meet the needs or desires of the end users. And of course, we'll all have experience, and we will all have seen projects that were designed around wants rather than needs. And so really working to identify your stakeholders, your partners, and engaging with them around their needs and their desires, or specifically their needs, allows us to really zone in, really come in and build projects that meet the scope that we are working with. So before you begin, you'll need to be working to identify who are your end users, who are your stakeholders. Now, this word stakeholder is grossly overused in the world that we live in. Realistically, from my own definition of a stakeholder, who is anybody who is impacted by or can impact a project that we're working on. And I find that that is a big enough scope that we are able to really start thinking beyond the normal suspects, the usual suspects. And one thing, we do a lot of training on stakeholder identification and integration with regards to project planning here at the Staff College. But one of the discussions that I like to have with my learners around stakeholders is it's not enough just simply to say the Ministry of Finance. We need to understand who in the Ministry of Finance, we need to understand departments in the Ministry of Finance and why they would need to be involved in that. So one mental tool checklist that I try and encourage my learners, our learners to engage with is imagining that our stakeholders are being invited to a meeting. You can't have the Ministry of Finance sitting in a meeting room. So you need to be really going that next step to identify beyond just Ministry of Finance, for example, who is it that you're going to be engaging with. If you don't have a name, then at least getting to the level of department and really thinking about why they need to be involved in your project and what impact they may have. One critical element for user-centered design also is that we need to allow us time, because it does take time for us to engage with our end users, to identify with them, but also to build trust, particularly if we're engaging in communities that we may not be a part of initially. We need to ensure that the communication that we are receiving, that the feedback that we are receiving is coming from a position of trust that we have built. So it does take a little bit of time. We also need to allow time for research. We also need time to allow time for analysis. And this is also where some of the discussions from last week's session around partnerships can come into play, because we can be working with partners and different stakeholders to identify where we perhaps can use and engage with resources. And I'm not just talking financial resources, but human resources and perhaps data analysis resources, for example, that we would not have access to normally. The tool outlines 4 steps. So the first one is to gather data about your innovation end users, to synthesize any collected data, to articulate how this insight affects your users, and then finally to identify opportunities for innovation. And you'll see that obviously all of these elements build up to then identifying opportunities for innovation. It can be difficult. We will have all seen instances whereby innovation or these ideas of what the project is going to look like dictate the structure of the project before we engage with our end users, whereas we're trying with this tool to flip that around so that we can have a more focused engagement and really work to nail the needs of our users. The first step, to gather data about your innovation users, and as with all of the tools in the toolkit, there are these worksheets that are provided with the tool. So the tool outlines the steps that you're going to go through. It has examples filled out. It also has, as I indicated at the start, a UN-based case study, but also it has these worksheets that you are able to download, you are able to discuss with your team, discuss with your unit, with your stakeholders, with your end users, so that you are able to identify the processes that you are going to go through in this instance for collecting data. And of course, that's important when we talk about outlining roles and responsibilities, as well as outlining communications plans with our end users, with our stakeholders, but also internally and externally. The data collection worksheet really focuses and forces us to identify the values, the priorities, and the needs of our end users, and asks ourselves, what are the knowledge gaps? What do we not know? What details best inform our design decisions? And how do we get a common frame of reference? So how do we understand exactly who our users are? Now that's a bit esoteric, that's a bit vague perhaps, but we go a little bit deeper then by identifying how are we going to gather this data. Is it going to be through observation? Do we have access to do that? If we don't have access to do that, how do we gain access to do that? Who do we need to be engaging with in regards to communication and partnerships? Are we going to hold focus groups? How do we hold those? Is it online? Is it face-to-face? How big are the focus groups? Who do we have that is able to run those focus groups? Who do we have that has the capacity to and the goodwill, for example, to engage with these focus groups? And then similarly, we need to be asking questions if we are undertaking in-depth interviews, which obviously take a little bit more time, but are useful if we're starting to identify perhaps outliers that may not feel that they are able or willing to share their specific needs and insight in a focus group interview, for example. And so we need to be working out how we are going to be gathering this data through each of these options, what resources we require. And when I talk about resources, it's not just financial, but it's social capital, it's human resources, for example. But we need to be thinking about this. And all of this is captured in the tool as well. Now I'm going to be introducing what are called action outlines, which are built into the tools now. Now, these action outlines are essentially a case study of the tool that has just been introduced, or the process that's just been introduced. And for the purposes of the user-centered design tool, it is based upon an organization which is looking at driving regional economic development by facilitating cross-border travel and commercial activity with a neighboring country. So they are seeking to understand the behaviors of commercial travelers at the border. So that is the kind of user that they have envisaged, and then they are working to go deeper into that using the tools I outlined in the toolkit. And this is the response that is incorporated into the worksheet and into the toolkit itself. So you can see over here, we have an overview of the process. They have undertaken a focus group interview with 14 travelers. They've identified the questions that are going to be answered. Now this, of course, these questions that are going to be answered, these are developed by you, by your unit, by your team or your organization, as you're working to really identify what the end user is that you are looking to incorporate into this project. So you can see here what brings them to this border crossing. Do they come repeatedly, or is this their first experience? What are the best and worst journeys parts of this journey. So 4 pretty focused questions, and then key activities that they are going to do to ask these questions. What are the likes of the people that they have interviewed? What are the dislikes of the people that they have interviewed? What is the environment that the people are coming from? So you can see that they have used this this toolkit, this worksheet, which is incorporated in the toolkit, to really start to understand what are some of the constraints of the people, of our end users. What do they like? What do they dislike? What do they really need? And so this will then inform a lot of the decision making as we work to further develop our innovation intervention. Step 2 is we work to synthesize the collected data. So we have now undertaken any number of these interviews, any number of these data collection activities, again, outlined in the toolkit. And there is another worksheet, a synthesis worksheet. How can you work to take all elements of this information? How do you work to identify themes? How do you work to then build that into your innovation effort? Because once again, we need to continually be working with our stakeholders and with our teams and our units to scope down to this information is informing an innovation process or an innovation effort that we are looking to develop. So we work to identify the key themes. What key challenges have they faced that perhaps we could solve through innovation? What are some of the underlying reasons for these challenges? And then what activities, this is a really important point at the end here, what activities that our participants like or feel they benefit from may be lost through this innovation activity. We need to not only be analyzing what are the potential benefits of our innovation, but what are also the potential losses to our end user of this innovation, so that we can work to balance that and we can work to communicate around that and not have any surprises that come up. To use to come back to the worksheet that is incorporated, and again, this is an example, this is built into the toolkit so that you are able to understand the process that is being presented within the toolkit. And you can see here that this has been, they have developed 3 themes. So the first theme here is around the participants staying in the urban center during their travel. So what is it that is important that these participants have, these people I've interviewed have frequent interaction with the communities, they stop for gas, they need to find lodging. So we're starting to think about how can we build that into our innovation planning. You can see here the theme summary. Another theme that has been identified is crossing the border into the economic zone. So some of the insights here are that there are long wait times, and this has generated a lot of negative sentiment about crossing into this zone. There's a lack of predictability and a feeling of helplessness, and there is not a lot of standardization, which further contributes to these challenges. So even from those insights, we can start thinking about low-hanging fruit that we can develop to build buy-in, build trust with the community. We can start to think about how this can be built into further planning for scalability of any innovation project that we're developing. Then down here, theme 3, declaring purchases and getting cleared. Some of the insights here is that there is redundant declaration activities can create substantial negative sentiment and potentially minimize future crossing activities. So it seems that there is too many of these declaration activities, which is seen as a waste of time and would mean that people don't want to cross here, which means a lack of income for the customs department, as well as negative feelings from the end user. So again, starting to understand what is their journey like, how are they feeling in this process. Step 3 in the tool is to articulate how this insight would affect the users. And to do this, we develop what are called personas or a journey map. And again, there are worksheets built into the tool for you to use. A user persona represents a cluster of users with similar patterns. So we can imagine that the people who had negative experiences at the border can be incorporated into one user persona, and we can start putting together an idea of who are these people, what do they feel like, how do we communicate with them, and how do they communicate with us, how do we work to engage with them further to find out more information. Then, for example, another way of doing this is a journey map, so helping organize ideas around user experience. so we can work to visually display relationships between the end users and the systems that they interact with. Now there is one of these. This here is a journey map which is built into the worksheet, into the tool, so that you are able to see how this can work. Now this here has a representative quote. This here has, who are these people? What are their needs? What are they angry about? So we can start to build up a picture of our end user, and we can start to think about how our innovation can engage with them, how our proposed innovation is going to meet those needs, is going to allow us to meet those frustrations, and hopefully solve a lot of those frustrations. And then here you can see this has been mapped out into steps that this person must take in order to cross this border. So again, we can break down this very large scale journey that we've identified into steps, which we can then explore a little bit deeper and approach from a position of scope, doability. Are we able to affect the journey at the border crossing? Are we able to engage around the declaration of business samples, for example? Is there any way that we can innovate to make this a more satisfying and a smoother process for this end user? Finally, we look at step 4. We identify then the opportunities for innovation. And as I mentioned at the start, it's so important that we start with this better idea of our end users and then build out the innovative project that we are looking to develop, rather than being led by an idea which may be erroneous. We may have we may not understand our end user at the start of the process. So using the personas and the journey worksheets that you have developed, using the information that you have gathered from all of the steps of this tool, you can then ask yourself about your innovation. Does this address the challenges that my end user faces? Does it improve their most difficult challenges? And does it help them achieve their goals and desires, which of course we have identified as part of our engagement and our communication? And there is here a useful sentence structure which we must pose to our teams, to our units, as a user type. So in this case, as somebody who's wanting to cross this border, I want a desired feature or solution. I want to be able to cross the border with a minimum of repeated declaration processes, so that I am able to get to market faster and get home faster. So that's just an example here, but it's important that we continually push this to our teams, to our units, to our stakeholders, so that we are working to scope really around the identification of our end user, around the information that we have received through the process and the use of this tool. Now this here is an example of the last step that this team has undertaken in regards to the tools that have been presented. I'll leave you to look through the tool and examine that. Now there is a case study, as always, with the tools, with the toolkit. In this case, it is the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, applying user-centered design techniques to incorporate the perspective of refugee entrepreneurs when launching a non-governmental organizations or innovation award and hosting startup weekends. So you will see in the toolkit each of these steps that I've just very quickly gone through put into a real-life example from UNHCR, and you are able to also reach out to people to discuss that further, and there are a number of tools and resources available in that worksheet. Once again, if you do wish to reach out to me, please do feel free. My email address, the email address for the innovation unit is innovation@unssc.org. You have the tool, the address for the toolkit as well. I'm available for questions and answers. I am very aware that that was a pretty quick introduction to a useful tool, and I remain available to answer questions now. Alternatively, please feel free to engage with me through my email address, and I am looking forward to engaging with you next week when we look at culture and we look at the tools, one of the tools that is built into the culture element. Johanna, over to you.